So the only thing that can happen if President Putin meets with President Trump is that President Putin doesn't get what he wants. So why even meet with the guy, right? Because you're only going to make President Trump look good. You're not going to look good. You're going to look weak. And I've said it before that President Putin literally cannot stop this war because the Russian economy is it's off the rails right now, and it is overheating. And so if he stopped the war tomorrow and recalled soldiers, let's say they froze Ukrainian lines completely, they froze the lines in Ukraine, you would leave some soldiers in place, but a lot of soldiers would be demobilized. Well, now you have soldiers going home. They know how to use a gun. They don't have a job. They can't get a job. And suddenly all these people in weapons factories, they're out of a job as well. What is that a recipe for? Now, I know gun laws in Russia aren't the same as the United States, but I'll tell you this, if you're a former soldier and you know how to use a weapon, and maybe you did some shady stuff when you were a soldier, you can find weapons. It's not that hard. And now you have this perfect storm of men who have fought, they know how to kill, and they know how to use weapons. That's how you end up hung upside down outside of a gas station like Mussolini. Or you get the Ceausescu special. So President Putin literally can't stop this war because if he does, there is a significant risk that he might be removed from power.
But do you believe that Trump is capable of persuading Vladimir Putin or forcing him to stop this war with aiding Ukraine, with sending military equipment to Ukraine, allowing to strike inside Russia, and another portion of sanctions against Russian economy? Because on the other hand, there are lots of discussions that Russia cannot sustain such a high regime of sanctions for a long haul, for a long time, because Russia's economy has started to struggle, has started struggling because the interest rates are more than 20%. The GDP growth is slowed down by Western sanctions. There is a high rate of inflation in Russia. So do you believe that Trump can persuade Vladimir Putin to stop this war, even if he faces a physical threat to his life, even if Vladimir Putin will face a physical threat to his life?
I don't think so. And I say that because there's too many disadvantages to stopping the war. What I can see is President Trump convincing President Putin to continue the war, and that's when he starts losing ground. And I'm glad you mentioned the economy and sanctions because one of the big problems with Russia right now is rail cars. A lot of the rail cars are made in the West. And a lot of this comes back to machine tools. Machine tools are the computer numeric control manufacturing systems that build parts. And you have a finite number of these machine tools. Russia doesn't really have a machine tool industry. China doesn't really have one either. So they get a lot of these machine tools from Europe. Now it's been about 3 years, and they've been using these machine tools essentially nonstop for 3 years to make parts. Well, now you have a choice. You can use these machine tools to make parts for the oil rigs that are driving your economy. You can use these machine tools to make weapons, or you can use these machine tools to make the bogies, which are the wheels that are underneath the rail cars, because those things are breaking down. So if you don't make parts for the oil rigs, you can't pay your army. You can't sell the oil to China and India and pay your army. If you don't make the weapon systems, your army has nothing to fight with. And if you don't make the bogies for underneath the rail cars, then you have no way of transporting your weapons, and that's an issue, right? So I could easily see a point where the sanctions work in the sense that Russia, they'll never be out of ways to make weapons, make oil rig parts, or make parts for rail cars, but there'll be less of them. And that will slowly build up to the point where we see Russia attacking with 1 or 2 tanks instead of 10, right? Because there's just fewer ways to logistically supply them. And I think that's when you're going to see the tide turn for Ukraine, and it will be a slow advance on Ukraine's side as different parts of Russian lines collapse. So can President Trump convince Putin to stop the war? No, but I believe that he can get the right weapons to Ukraine so that maybe not this year, but by next year, Russia is on the back foot to the point where they can't push weapons out to the front fast enough, and you start to see Ukraine gain ground. So this might be a stop the war in 2026, 2027 kind of thing, where Russia has to stop the war in 2 years because there's essentially no way of feeding all their troops, getting all their troops equipment. And by that point, you're going to run that risk of getting thrown out of office. But if you don't stop the war, the soldiers will rebel because they have no equipment to fight with.
So you're confident that Vladimir Putin can agree with Trump's proposal on a ceasefire only if he loses the ground in Ukraine?
I think it would be a last resort thing. It would probably be something that would happen in 2027. They're essentially going to run out of vehicles in, I guess, the next year or so. Now, they'll never really run out because they can still manufacture vehicles at about a rate of 50 a month, tanks and BMPs and so on. But their supply of cheap tanks from the Cold War is essentially gone. I think they have 2,000 or so vehicles left. And I don't know how many vehicles I don't know how long they can make that last. But if Covert Cabal, which is it's an organization on YouTube that literally counts tanks, if Covert Cabal is right, they have about 2,000 some vehicles left, and that'll probably last the next year.
So it seems like Vladimir Putin faces critical dilemma, because if he stops the war against Ukraine, according to your opinion, he will be deposed, dethroned, and he will be decapitated. His government, he will be deposed, and he could face a physical threat to his life. He could be eliminated. On the other hand, if he does not stop the war against Ukraine, economical issues will even be stronger for Russia, and the critical problems which are faced by Russia now will be even bigger, and Russia will not be able to sustain such critical issues.
You're absolutely correct. And one thing I have to give you credit for is that you use the word dilemma correctly. A dilemma is where you have to choose between two equally bad outcomes. And the one difference is that if President Putin continues the war, there may be some sort of saving grace. Something might happen that will prevent eventually Russia is going to collapse. It could collapse soon, or it could collapse later.
So you believe that Russia right now, definitely will collapse sometime in the future?
Yes. Yeah, I have almost no doubt that Russia will collapse at some point. If they stop the war, they'll collapse almost immediately. If they continue the war, I think there's actually less of a chance of collapse, because something might come up to the point where they're able to either make a breakthrough or something goes in their favor. It could be something as simple as Western Europe decides they've had enough of this. They want cheap Russian gas again. We're not going to support Ukraine anymore or send them shells. There is a non-zero chance that could happen. There is a non-zero chance that Russia could do an information war push to convince people that we're going to use nuclear weapons on the West if this doesn't stop. That might actually work. And then all of a sudden they are able to take ground because people stop supplying Ukraine with weapons. So if you want to get technical, it is better to, at least for Russia, it is better to continue the war in the hopes that other avenues might pay off for completing the annexation of Ukraine, although that could take years.
Also, from your perspective, it seems like Vladimir Putin also faces a dilemma about his physical threat, because if he continues the war against Ukraine, he could also